Welcome back, AI curious folk, to AI Ramblings Daily, the podcast, episode 74 by Michael Parekh, your human AI guide. Today, we're going to jump into a few things that are a little different than what we generally talk about. They are current events that are going on, but they're a little bit more in the weeds, the technical weeds. But they point to an area that is very important for regular users, which is what this AI Ramblings is all about, is how all of these AI technical and other changes are impacting things, creating things that we, billions of us, can use usefully down the road and affordably, of course. So let me just provide the frame for what ties our core theme. First, the theme here is that the AI companies, large, medium, small, existing tech companies, the new startups, everyone is experimenting, looking for the truly mainstream user interface and user experience. It's known as UI UX in techie jargon. Basically, everyone's trying to figure out how to blend typing to AIs, talking to AIs, and then the rich graphical user interfaces that we use to deal with computers and files and data that we've learned how to do over the last 25, 30 years, thanks to Microsoft with its Windows, and of course, Apple, and everything we do on our smartphones with iOS and Android and so on. And all these things, it's very easy to forget because a lot of you are young folk, someone like me who's kind of lived through this through a variety of tech waves over 3-4 decades. And it's very easy to forget that there was a period for almost an entire decade in the 1980s when the PC first emerged in the early 1980s. Time magazine made the first computer from IBM, a person of the year, a thing of the year in 1982. The core innovation there was the operating system software from Microsoft called MS-DOS, a disk operating system. And I'm going into the details here because for better part of a decade or more, most people learn how to work with computers, the operating system, and all the applications through typing into what's called a command line interface. You just type text and you learn certain commands and the thing did things for you. That's where we are with AI today. If you think about chatbots, with OpenAI kind of had its chatbot moment with ChatGPT back in November 30th, 2022, the last 3+ years. It's basically us typing into chatbots, basically asking for answers that are longer than what we've been used to getting from Google search, getting sentences instead of words. And increasingly, all the companies are also using multimodality, fancy word, basically talk to these things as well. So OpenAI took the charge here, inspired by the movie Her, and basically introduced a voice modality that you could talk to your AI just like you could talk to theoretically in sci-fi movies like Her, and gave it personality, right? It gave it all kinds of voices, friendly. Basically, the objective was to make the AI more human, and so leverage the human tendency to anthropomorphize anything that we see that feels and looks human. We do that with our pets. Over half the population owns pets, and we have very deep relationships with our pets because of this. The volleyball in the movie Castaway, basically with Tom Hanks, was about a person just connecting to a volleyball. That's what's happening to our AIs. We're treating them in many cases, these things as companions and so on. And that's actually a business objective of these companies. They want you to connect and come back, give them a warm personality. And it runs the spectrum. And that's a whole deep issue that I'll talk about in subsequent posts. But the theme I want to talk about here is that AI industry is very aggressively looking for mainstream UI UX experiences that tie these things together more seamlessly. And again, we're very early and there's a lot of experimentation going on. And there are 3 events that happened this week that I want to talk about that touch on this broad theme. And this is an ongoing theme that will address not just these 3 things I want to talk about, but a lot of things to come. So first up, there's an AI startup, multi-billion-dollar startup, founded by one of the co-founders of OpenAI, Mira Murati, called Thinking Machine Labs. They raised a few months ago $2 billion, an extraordinary seed round, $2 billion on $12 billion. They had some of the world's best AI researchers from OpenAI and other places. They lost some of them to some of the other big companies. There's all kinds of kerfuffle and soap opera stuff going around on this. But the company Thinking Lab, I'm going to call them TML in this discussion. They introduced yesterday a large language model that was really designed ground up in a different way. It is designed to be both voice and text, fully duplex, meaning it can be totally interrupted constantly by humans, and it can basically break up all your prompts into very short chunks that it runs through both a time sensitive filter and a language model filter. And so it is supposed to be a lot more interactive, a lot more real human feeling. Its response time is under 400 milliseconds, which is gobbledygook for most people, but it means that level of latency or interactivity response time makes it feel more natural, human-like. And that's the objective. This is a good technical accomplishment. And so it's time aware, it's fully duplex, it runs it has essentially two sets of engines in its language model that's doing the language model stuff and then the interactivity stuff built in core at the operating system level of this, as it were. And so it's interesting. Now, what's curious is it's early. They haven't released it to people, so there's no people kicking around. I will have links of the announcement, including some YouTube videos where they demonstrate some of this stuff, and you can make the judge of if it's interesting or not. I went through it a couple of times, and more importantly, I went through the AI paper related to the whole thing, and it is interesting. And there will be ideas here that will impact the things that are going on by everyone from Google to Apple with its Siri to Amazon with its Alexa, and of course OpenAI that is very aggressively focused on this. So there are some interesting ideas, and I'm sure there will be also an inspiration potentially for people in China, all the companies that are trying to build open source models, because there are some interesting ideas technically that break apart this problem in a different way, where the UI UX is baked in to the operating system, which is kind of analogous to how Windows kind of built on top of MS-DOS. But in that era, it took better part of a decade to happen. Obviously, a lot of that was inspired by what Steve Jobs was doing with the Mac versus the Apple II. And there's a whole series of movies and books and stuff written about that. But what took years there is likely to take a few years, maybe even a few months here. And that is why the TML development today is of interest to a geek like me. And I thought I'd share that with you because there is a mainstream aspect to this, because today's way of working with AI, whether it's the chatbot stuff or the AI agent stuff, is relatively unnatural. It is clunky. It is designed for developers. It's hugely popular amongst developers, but it's very geeky. And it actually runs into the second thing I wanted to talk about, because there were a couple of tweets which I'll have in the show notes. Andre Karpathy, who's the developer's developer, he invented the term vibe coding. He endorsed something that Anthropic's people had developed, this idea that you can go into Claude Code or Claude Cowork and give it a prompt that says, hey, everything you're giving me in terms of results, instead of putting it in what's called markdown files, which is a text-oriented format that is optimized for the computers and a little bit for humans, but mostly for the computers, MD it's called. But instead of doing that, put it in HTML form, which means that it renders as a web page. Now, why is that important for regular folks? Because if you click on that output, it then looks very rich with graphs and charts and colors and so on. Very different than what an MD markdown file looks like. And most of the output that you get today in these AI agents, if you use Cloud Code, which I don't recommend non-programmers from doing, but you can be using Cowork. But Cowork, which is a hugely successful product by Anthropic, billions of dollars in revenue. But Cowork basically assumes when you start to deal with it that you know all the technical terms that the model is using. That is, it's all computer language, and you're supposed to learn all this stuff on the fly, markdown files, the way it memorizes and remembers how to load itself into the context window, and all of these things. It's very similar, again, what regular early adopters like me had to do with the early days of the PC in the 80s, both on the Apple side and on the MS-DOS Microsoft side. Same thing. We had to crawl through the glass of techie, buzzy things and learn that. And that's where we are with the AI world. And this little hack, as it were, on HTML output by these developers is a is a step in this on this well-worn road. And I just wanted to highlight that. The third take I have for today is Anthropic itself with Claude introduced something called Agent View. Again, they introduced this in Claude Code, again, for the developers, the tens of millions who you literally are building huge amounts of code and software on Claude Code infrastructure. And obviously, OpenAI Codex is the other competing one. Microsoft Copilot is the third one. But Claude introduced this thing called Agent View, which is another interface again. It allows you to take a whole bunch of the sessions that are running. Again, for regular people, it doesn't mean as much, but it makes it far easier to track all the various agents that are running for you, the agents and sub-agents, in a view that is more optimized. Again, I point this out. This is a geeky thing. Normally, we wouldn't talk about this. But these are all important steps as these companies try to figure out how to make this stuff easier for users. Initially, early adopters, initially coders, but very quickly, regular people that are going to have to deal with this and deal with it with voice, with typing and graphical elements. That's why these three things that are very separate in some ways are kind of tied together, and we will see it all connect even further down the road. This stuff also ties into my gadget AI topic, because Google, which has been for months hinting that they are going to be basically fusing their Chrome operating system and the Chrome browser, which is the number one browser on the planet. Over 70% of the browsers are Chrome, and the other one is, of course, Safari on iOS. And I've written a lot about how AI browsers are going to be a big thing. I've done a lot of podcasts and write-ups on that. But they're introduced, and remember, Google's is for 15 years has had something called the Chromebook, which is essentially a Chrome OS with Chrome browser that runs on a laptop that's supposed to be $300, $400, $500, and some memory, and it basically does most of the things people need. It's been hugely popular in schools and so on as a relatively inexpensive laptop. But for months now, they've been basically saying they're going to fuse the Android app ecosystem, which is tens of thousands of apps around the world, just like the Apple iOS app ecosystem. And they're going to make those apps be able to run on laptops that are Chromebook and Chrome OS. So they're introducing this idea called a Googlebook. There's a hardware product that'll be coming out this fall. They just kind of announced it. This is all ahead of their developer conference coming up in a few days called Google I/O, and Sundar Pichai, the CEO, will talk about it, I'm sure, but some of this is leaking out. And it's interesting because, again, this is business of rethinking UI UX for what we think of as apps on a smartphone, on an Android phone, what we think about apps in terms of our Chrome browsers with just-in-time applications that just pop up when you type in things. And increasingly, AI is changing all of this. So Google also announced something called Gemini Intelligence, which is essentially the Gemini models basically running on the fly on whether it's a Chromebook or a Chrome OS or Android, and creating essentially apps and widgets for you on the fly. So they're super customized to you. Think about it as vibe coding by the computer, in this case, running whichever operating system you happen to be running, whether it's a smartphone, whether it's a Pixel notebook or a Chrome OS notebook, etc. Again, a lot of geeky stuff here. Most regular people should tune off on this. Again, we're talking about this because these eventually be very quickly mainstream products. And this effort by Google is kind of a response to Apple introducing, and I wrote a lot about this as well. This is one of their runaway products, which is called the Apple Neo Notebook, $500 until the prices go up because of the memory stuff. It runs on an iOS chip from last year. And it's terrific. For the most people, this is the computer to get, and you get it in nice 4 colors, yellow, blue, etc. I have the blue indigo one. But it's great for students. It's great for elderly people. If my parents were still alive, my mom particularly, I would get her one of these, and I already know what color she would have wanted. But anyway, the point is, it was a tough Mother's Day this weekend. But it's she passed away 3 years ago, just a personal note. But she used to love these gadgets, and she didn't speak English. And these things increasingly now basically talk in any language, etc. And they run on an iOS chip. So what's interesting is this is where the world is going. AI is going to be fused into our gadgets, whether it's smartphones, our desktops. They'll speak any language. The developments by TML earlier, it's about making the voices sound a lot more natural. In fact, the video link I will have as a demo is literally a fellow, an engineer at TML, speaking in Hindi and being live translated into English on a concurrent basis. Now, a lot of operating systems can do that. A lot of AI systems can do that, but this is a little bit more seamless if you listen for the technical points where it's different from a latency point of view. I talk about all of this together in a clump because these are all separate things that are going on, but they're pointing directionally into this area where these systems are, the companies are trying to figure out what is the best user interface quickly for regular people to deal with this stuff, because otherwise it's way too clunky. Users are otherwise required to know a lot of techie things, how computers work, and increasingly the cognitive load of how computers work should be just offloaded onto the computers, because we're giving them huge amount of GPUs and CPUs and memory to just do all this stuff for us. And that is the point. This is not about when AI surpasses human intelligence. This is when AI does more interesting things than humans can do without it, just like we can walk at a certain pace, but once we get on a plane, we travel a lot faster. And that's all this stuff is. And everything here that I'm talking about in this episode in 74 is about this effort to figure out the best new UI UX, and a lot of companies are taking a stab at it. So that is my general discussion of the three items and my gadget AI take, which I want to lead into the couple of questions. One question I got from a listener, because I've been a long-time Chromebook user, own almost every model that's been out, and there are dozens of OEMs creating Chromebooks, and Google has one with their own model, and they stopped doing that for a while. The first question was, what's my favorite Chromebook feature? And I got to tell you, for the longest time, the coolest feature of Chromebook was simply that I could turn on this machine. It was typically $300-400. And basically, you literally didn't have to worry about the operating system. The thing just ran. This was actually a Chromebook version was literally one I got for my mom, who, as I said, passed away 3 years ago. And she couldn't tell you a computer interface from a hole in the wall, but she used the computer just in huge ways, because she could just deal with just clapping away or talking to it, and it would do all these things for her. That was the magical experience of a Chromebook for the longest time. You didn't have to worry about how the computer worked, how the operating system worked. It just worked because you just use it like a browser, and it figured out all the rest in the Chrome OS part. And that's what I'm optimistic that things like the Googlebook with the fusing of the desktop and the smartphone is going to be a step in the right direction. That's what I'm hoping Apple does with Neo, with expanding that in terms of the two systems and make this stuff a lot easier. Second question, what's my biggest wish for a feature on a Chromebook? And this is a tough one, because especially with all the things that we're talking about with AI coming into the mix, etc., is that we don't know what is the best feature on a Chromebook. The biggest feature that we typically have, if you were just dealing with Chromebooks as they've been there for 15 years, is that when you wanted your local data or some local applications that didn't run on the web on a Chrome browser, that's when you missed your computer. And the features that we're talking about with Googlebook by Google, which they will talk more about presumably at Google I/O in a few days, are attempting to bridge that gap. And so that has been the longest wish for feature, I think, of most Chromebook users and Chrome OS users. And we are getting to a point, maybe not this year, but hopefully by next year, to where the stuff is a lot easier. So it's all very exciting for geeks like me, early adopters, gadget freaks, AI, technology, probabilistic systems, deterministic system. It's just great stuff. A lot of stuff is being experimented with. But I wanted to convey a little bit of this excitement to regular folk, you AI curious folk, in terms of where this is going and what is happening today, why it's interesting beyond the headlines of what's out there. That's one of our core things of why I do this AI Ramblings podcast every day. I just want to translate and communicate some of the enthusiasm beyond the gobbledygook. So thanks for joining us again today on 74. We'll be back tomorrow with 75, of course, and my AI Reset to Zero 1085. Just as a heads up, I do have our post on Reset to Zero for today, where I talk more about the Cerebras IPO and a lot of the AI infrastructure developments, which I touched on a little bit in yesterday's podcast, but I have a lot of written discussion around that today, which may be of interest. So again, thanks for joining us and stay tuned.